right, welcome back to another Shifting Schools. We have a great episode for you here today, where we're going to be talking to the author of the book, Conferring in the Math Classroom, a practical guidebook to using 5-minute conferencing to grow confident mathematicians. Trisha, tell us a little bit more about today's guest.
Today's guest is Dr. Gina Picha, who has been over the past 15 years working as a classroom teacher, instructional coach, curriculum specialist, and district math coordinator. Gina is passionate about providing elementary students with daily opportunities to engage as mathematicians by exploring, making conjectures, and sharing ideas in ways that reinforce their status as valued members of a math community. In this episode, we dig into what she means by math community, as well as just the heaps of practical advice that's within her book. And Jeff, we even kind of go deep into what is the point of math? So kind of like a big esoteric and practical conversation all at once. What for you was sort of the big shifted thought that you left our conversation with?
I think the big one for me is just the power of conversations with kids. And I think I keep coming back to this idea of, what did we miss when we were in the pandemic? Why do we want to be back face to face? And a huge part of it is we're social beings. We want our classrooms to be social. We want them to be loud. We talk about this in the podcast, Trisha, where you're like, in our day in the math class, it was basically do the odds or the even numbers. Everybody be quiet and do your math, and it's a right or wrong answer. And what we're moving towards is this idea is this hum of the classroom. And every educator knows that perfect hum where kids are talking and there's laughter and there's struggle and it's not quiet. And I think that's really what we're talking about today is using the book, using some of these ideas of how do we get that in our math classroom? How do we use conferencing as a way to get kids to talk? How are we conversing with students? What are some stems and some sentence starters that we can use in our math classrooms to support kids in actually talking in math and changing that mindset of what is the purpose of math? Like, what is it really other than making sure you've got the right answer? There's way more to math than making sure you have the right answer. And that's really what I kind of took away from today. Is I want my classroom to hum. I don't want it to be quiet,
Yeah, absolutely. She really reminds us of the huge value there is in curiosity. So I think, folks, you'll find as you're listening, just this constant reminder of how am I helping my students, regardless of what you're teaching, how am I helping them to get more curious about their own ideas, their own thought processes, and why is that necessary, right? If we want students who are going to go out into the world and be confident thinkers, problem solvers, they need to be rehearsing that now. So I think this is a great conversation. Loved learning more about her book and also just that push, as you were saying, Jeff, to really value conversation as community building and as a critical practice.
Yeah, it's such a great interview. I'm excited to get over to it. But before we do that, a quick word from today's show sponsors. Mackin Via from Mackin is a free digital content management system offering more than 3 million digital titles, including ebooks, audiobooks, read-alongs, databases, and videos. To date, this highly sought-after digital content management system has been awarded 20 distinctive national honors, including multiple Best of Show awards at ISTE, several awards of excellence by Tech and Learning, and Product of the Year by Modern Library Awards. Today, Mackin Via can be found in thousands of schools and accessed by more than 9 million students around the world. To see what Mackin Via can do for you, visit mackinvia.com today. That's MACKINVIA.com and set up your free account. And a reminder that you can save $50 on registration at the upcoming NCCE conference here in the state of Washington, March 21st through 23rd, by using the code SHIFTINGSCHOOLS50. That's all one word, Shifting Schools and the number 50. We will also be recording a live Shifting Schools podcast with anyone who wants to join us in room 406 at 2 p.m. on March 23rd. Thank you to NCCE for sponsoring Shifting Schools and giving us a space to record an episode live. If you have a conference or workshop that you would like to promote on the podcast, please reach out to us at info@shiftingschools.com. All right, and with that, we're headed over to the interview with the author of Conferring in the Math Classroom, a practical guidebook to using 5-minute conferencing to grow confidence mathematicians. Really written for the K-5 teacher, but I'm pretty sure everybody's going to be taking something away. It's all about conferencing and getting kids to talk in the classroom. And with that, on with the show.
We are so excited to be sitting here today with Dr. Picha, who has a great book out. Folks who I think are big believers in the power of check-ins, one-to-one conversations with learners. This is a great book. And you kind of remind us that the idea of having a conference with students is something that many literacy professionals are familiar with, but really it's a practice that works across all subject areas. So thank you for joining us to discuss the many rich ideas inside your brand new book that's entitled Conferring in the Math Classroom, a practical guidebook to using 5-minute conferences to grow confident mathematicians. The book takes us through ways that teachers in kindergarten through 5th grade, and I would even say like beyond there, can leverage the power of conferences. You outline very early on that there are 3 essential elements of a math conference. Number 1, listening and observing. Number 2, naming students' strengths. And lastly, number 3, encouraging students to share. You talk about how these conferences are very brief, which is great because, using time is always one of the complicated things that teachers need to juggle. Can you talk about how these short conferences help students work on their math identity?
Yes, absolutely. When I talk about math conferences, a phrase or a word that I often talk about are hidden regularities in terms of our classrooms. And so those are sort of the things that aren't spoken, that students get used to, that students are doing each day daily as mathematicians. And I think Conferring really supports some of those hidden regularities that we would want for our classrooms. And one of the things that we would want is students believing in themselves as mathematicians and students having what we would call a positive math identity. And so when I think about a math identity, I'm thinking in terms of certainly a student's belief about their ability to do math, but also their feelings and beliefs about what the subject of math is. So are they thinking of math as a series of steps that are disconnected that they have to memorize and follow? Or are they thinking of math in a connected way, thinking about how different things they've learned are connected, and also thinking about math as creative, a subject in where they have choice in the way that they do things and that they can invent things and think outside the box. And so I think Conferring is a structure that could help bring about some of those hidden regularities into our classroom to where students are having opportunities that are regular enough that it's affecting their math identities in positive ways. And so when we're conferring with students, although they're really short, they're really purposeful. And students are doing the thinking work. They're doing the talking work. They're sharing. They're encouraged to share. And I think one of the most important things about a math conference is the way in which students' strengths are being highlighted on a daily basis, not just for them, but for their peers as well. So we're developing this culture in which we see one another as important members of a math community. And we're seeing on a daily basis that we can learn from each and every person in this classroom, and that together we're building our collective understanding of mathematics.
I really like that. And being a 4th grade teacher, I think there's a lot. I love this idea of growing your math identity. I could just see myself as a 4th grade teacher using those words in my classroom as well. One of the things I found really interesting, through the book was that you use the word nudge a lot. And you're constantly kind of talking about what are the nudges we can do. Can you maybe explain a little more about nudging and perhaps give our listeners an example of what would that look like in action?
Yes, absolutely. So you had brought up the idea that sometimes when we think of conferences, we're thinking of literacy conferences. And for listeners who might be experienced with that, they might know that in a literacy conference, oftentimes there's a direct teaching point that happens. Not all the time, but a lot of the times. And because the content pedagogy around literacy is different than it is with math. When we're conferring with readers and writers and we give a very direct teaching point, it often doesn't take the creativity away from them. The piece that they're creating will still likely be different than their peers, most certainly. And they still have a lot of creative decision-making left to make. So in a math conference, then what do we do if we're not wanting to come in and like stamp this sort of teaching point, or you should do this, or try this? So instead, we want to nudge students forward in their thinking. And we can do this in a couple of ways. We can nudge them in ways that stay within the task that they're working on. So nudging them to think deeply about the math that's within the context that's already in the problem that they're working on or the task that they're working on. We could also nudge them to think deeply about the concept in general, which would be nudging them to make generalizations, really getting under the math. How does this work? Why does this work? When does this work? And so that's what that nudging work sounds like. So for example, if I'm working with some students and maybe they are doing a task in which they're comparing unit fractions, and maybe the students that I'm working with are using a really abstract representation. Maybe they put some fractions on a number line. One way that I might want to nudge their thinking is to really make connections between representations. So I might nudge them to think about different ways that they could be representing those unit fractions and nudging them to share within the community. So that nudge is often combined with an invitation to share, whether it's at the community share or just with others around you. What are some other ways of thinking about this? What are some other ways of representing this? If we're looking at a strategy rather than representation, how is your strategy similar or different than others that are working on the same thing? And a nudge to think beyond the task would be asking questions like, does this work all the time? When does this work? I see you did this with whole numbers. Do you think that works with rational numbers? Things like that. And those nudges, students are nudged to really come up with their own problems and sort of test things out and develop their own understanding and share out that understanding about how this thing works. We're doing this one problem, but where else does this work? How does this work? And when does it not work?
What I appreciate about that, and again, I'll point out in the book, you have so many different sort of question examples for teachers to play around with inside of these conferences. And I left the book really with the idea that a math lesson is a wonderful space for curiosity, right? And instead of, I'm going back to perhaps my own childhood and thinking about how there really wasn't space for curiosity. It was very much like a polarized right or wrong, and that's it. I cannot really remember being asked, like you were just saying, like, does this work all the time or just some of the time? Or, even just the broader idea of, tell me why that's the way that you approach this question. It was really not any kind of interest in terms of what my journey was as a mathematician, really just sort of hey, what does the answer key say? And if it's not that, try again. And I think with many things in education, if we're fostering that curiosity as a stance, belonging is also achieved. I'm thinking, Dr. Picha, just about the idea that you go through a lot of the advantages in terms of helping students see themselves as mathematicians, but even just that relational piece of teacher and child getting to know one another, that comes through when we're having these regular check-ins as well. And something that I just absolutely adore about the book is that you remind us that when we invite students to share, it's not, hey, just share it with me, the teacher, I'm the only person in the room that matters, but it's about building a math community as a class. So your book goes deep into what that means, why it matters. Can you describe for listeners what we would see, sense, feel, or hear inside of a strong math community?
Sure. When I hear the words math community or that phrase, it's something that I've heard throughout my career, and it's something that I said very early on. That something maybe that I thought I should say in our classroom or math community, but what does that mean? And I don't know that, well, I know for sure early on in my career, I probably couldn't have explained, like, how is a math community of learners, when you say that that's what the classroom is, how is that different from a classroom of students who are doing math? So one of the things at some point in my career that really kind of interested me / bothered me was this idea that we're constantly telling students during literacy time that we want to engage, like, you're writers. This is a real writers workshop, and we're going to go through those motions as real writers. Then it felt like sometimes in math, it was a different type of math maybe than real mathematicians would be doing. So if we have a real authentic math community, then I think we would expect to see kids engaging as mathematicians. And so to me, what that would look like is students who are showing that they have a lot of agency in their work. They're engaged. They're taking ownership of their work. They aren't driven by the idea that they want to complete assignments so that they can turn them in and be done, but they're driven by this conjecture work, by this idea of discovering things and sharing with the math community. And they're seeing that, as you had said, the teacher is not the center of the math classroom. And I think that piece is so important, because when I think of a mathematician and I think about, as myself as a mathematician, it really wouldn't be that fun of a job of work if there was someone behind me that already knew the answer and was like asking me directed questions, trying to get me down a path that they already had been down and thought was the best, most efficient path. It would really take the love and joy out of it for me. So I think we want an environment, where students they see their work as grappling with the problem. And when the teacher approaches, we're seeing a less dependent learner and a more independent learner. We're seeing that because conferring has been happening often and in the same way. Students are less likely to lean into the teacher to try to find out what they might be doing next, and instead really engage with the teacher, as the teacher is really just sitting next to me, really truly just curious about what I'm doing. And my teacher finds what I'm doing interesting and thinks I should share my ideas with my peers. But my teacher isn't here to get me back on track or for corrective feedback. I think the most exciting thing we can see when this is done over an extended period of time is kids saying, can I make a conjecture? Like, even outside of a conference, maybe the teacher is conferring with someone else and a group of kids saying, like, we have a conjecture. And like, of course, yes, then we know that the kids really are having control of what's happening in the classroom, and they're really engaging as a math community.
I love that.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. I'm wondering, for some teachers who might be listening and thinking this idea of inviting regular, either small group or one-to-one conferences, for those who are listening and are thinking, this is a really huge shift in my practice, this is not necessarily the way that I've taught. I'm wondering if you just have any logistical tips. You have so many great question stems in the book. I was even thinking, the power of me having some of them printed out, having them around the room, making them visible, so I'm not feeling this false sense of pressure, remember all of Dr. Picha's questions, right? Do you have any just logistical strategies for someone who is digging into your book? They love the idea of spending more one-to-one short, conference time with students. What are some things that you think might make that pivot or that shift just a little bit easier?
Well, first, from a broader sense, just sort of tackling how it feels to start something new. I think one of the analogies that I love, maybe because just for me, this was an issue for me, but the idea of working out and going to a gym. I don't know how to use anything there. I'm going to fumble. Everyone around me is going to know that I've never even lifted a weight. And seeing something once that said, just go and get on the treadmill and start walking. That's your only goal at first. Just show up and do this one thing that you can do. And so I think that really transfers to the classroom, because I've often felt like that a lot in my career. There's a lot of things that we're asked to do sometimes, especially if we teach every subject. And you're asking me to remember a lot of different things and different protocols. And so my advice would be just take that first step of saying, when my kids are problem solving tomorrow, I'm going to pull up alongside a group and I'm just going to listen, and I'm just going to do the beginning part of the conference. I'm just going to listen in notice and observe and just ask some of those very natural questions. Why did you do that? First, what are you working on? And then, I noticed you did this. Why did you do that? One of the things that was really important to me when writing the book was that while I wanted to provide a lot of useful questions and if-then charts and things like that, I never wanted anyone to feel like I have to remember all these things, or I have to have like this binder with me to remember what to do. So another strategy I would have is always think about the goal and the question that you're asking. If your question is to find out more about uncovering their thinking, then asking them just questions, very natural questions. Tell me more about what you're working on. I find sometimes that when we get astray, it's because we aren't remembering the goal. So when we start to ask questions where we're kind of funneling, reminding ourselves, is our goal to get them to answer this problem correctly right now? Is that why I'm asking questions? Or is my goal right now to really understand their thinking and see where I can nudge them? Ideally, conferring would be a regular practice, but I don't think that that's a commitment that anyone needs to make in the beginning. So really just starting out with, I'm going to make the goal of just conferring with one group tomorrow. And I'm going to see how that goes. And maybe then I'll do 2 groups. The lovely thing about this, speaking from someone who's felt definitely the pressure and stresses of being a classroom teacher, is that the math block does not need to be arranged in order to do this. We're just working with kids when they're already engaged in problem solving. So it's really just the commitment of, hey, tomorrow I'm going to pull up alongside these kids and I'm going to listen in, and I'm going to see what happens.
I love that. I'm listening to you. I'm just thinking about, I was part of a research group back in my pre-service elementary ed days at Washington State University. I got hooked up with our math. Again, being an elementary teacher, you have to take every subject area, but our math teacher in the elementary cohort, and I ended up getting hooked up with her, and she was doing research into this idea of math talk. And what were we seeing when we had students actually vocalizing math? And that's really what this is, right? Like, we want to ask kids questions. We want to see what, not only what they know and how do we get the feedback from that, but anytime you can get kids to speak out loud about math. And the research was actually really cool. I mean, I was spending all this time down in 3rd and 4th grade classrooms with these, preset of questions, because we're doing research on what is this actually leading to any significant change. And we saw significant change in, at the time, the first standardized testing was coming out, and that was a huge focus. And we were seeing standardized change in classrooms where we were having students talk math. Right. And that, I think, is at the core of this. Right? It's asking questions that get kids to talk, that are getting kids to interact with math. As a teacher, I'm constantly trying to push kids to use math vocabulary out loud. So I'm always trying to ask questions of, and I'm using the math terms myself as a way to engage. I'm looking for kids to be using those math terms back. And I can use that also then as an assessment piece, right? Like, do kids understand when they say the word divide, or they say the word add, or they say fractions and numerator and denominator? Do they really know what they're talking about? And so in these conferencing techniques, you can, really take the vocabulary of math and do some even evaluation and assessment on where is this group of kids, or where is the student in understanding their math as well. So I was fortunate enough to be part of that research, and it's always been something I've been very passionate about since. Is just getting kids to talk in math, right?
Yeah.
I just love that. So
I love that. And I love the additional layer of vocabulary and how important that is. And I also think sometimes that can be a struggle, right? Like, we know we want kids using certain vocabulary, and sometimes it's receptive, but not always productive.
That's right.
And one of the things that I think is really exciting is seeing a little bit of a shift when they're writing their own conjectures, because suddenly there's an audience and suddenly I have a reason why I really want to be precise, because I want my peers to understand. And when we're sharing our conjectures and our students in the class are encouraged to kind of push back in respectful ways as mathematicians, they start to learn, like, when I present my next conjecture, I'm going to make sure I'm very clear with what I'm saying.
I love that.
And so there becomes a use then to refer to the word wall, or to use punctuation, how thinking about, that's like a really big idea, right? How do we get them to carry over the things they're working on in literacy into math? And I think it's useful when they're motivated to do it.
Yeah, and I've often felt like, many of us, or maybe I'm dating myself here, came up in an educational system that valued compliance and silence, right? Like often if the school leader was coming around, you could almost see like the nod back and forth between the teacher and the principal in terms of like, good job, they're quiet, right? They're quiet and working, and that must be a good thing. And, I feel like as a practitioner, then it took me a period of adjustment to realize the best learning is often happening when my classroom is really noisy, right? There's a lot of back and forth conversation. One group is then checking in with another group. And it's almost like this beautiful chaos. But, I kind of wanted to ask you in closing, when you were talking about teachers really thinking about what is my goal in this lesson, or what is my goal in this question. I'm a lit teacher, ELA teacher, and I think it's Matthew Kay in his book, Not Light But Fire, who reminds us, we're not subject teachers. It's not, I don't teach literature. I teach students who are learning about literature is a great way of framing it. And I always felt like, encouraging lifelong readers and writers is not necessarily about them publishing a book or having the most successful run of books checked out from the library, but it is an entry point into literally like understanding the world around us, getting curious about other stories so that we can also understand our own. Math is not my expertise, but your book had me thinking about, I don't know, is sort of one of your more esoteric goals, this idea of students becoming competent and confident problem solvers, not necessarily so that, they're like, out there doing flashcard wars and algebraic equations all the time, but so that also when they come across a problem in life, it's sort of like, I have had so many conversations about different ways to approach problems that I feel like I am going to be able to come to this from a place not of like, oh my gosh, what do I do next? But I am an experienced problem solver. Does that sound accurate, or does that sound totally off base?
No, absolutely. Yeah, and absolutely, that's the goal. And I always talk about how Lucy Calkins says for literacy that you're not teaching the piece, you're teaching the writer. And I feel the same should be the goal in the math conference. We're nudging them and developing them as mathematicians, and answering this one problem in front of them isn't the goal. And that feels off a little bit in the beginning when doing this work, because we're in this work to teach and we love and care about students. And so it feels sometimes uncomfortable watching them grapple with a problem and watching them struggle. But as you said, that's the end goal of what we're hoping for, is that when students come across really challenging problems in their life, that they're not trying to search their long-term memory for how their teacher taught them to do something and then feeling defeated when they can't find it. But I don't know how to solve this, but I know I can figure it out. And even it might take me a really long time, and I might do the most inefficient thing possible, but I am pretty confident I will be able to figure this out, because I've had a lot of experiences throughout my education where that happened. So I saw that success came from, started from a discomfort of not knowing.
Mm. Well,
yeah, and I think it's getting curious with how to solve problems, right? I mean, right to our point, I'm just thinking this, last weekend we were laying some more LVP flooring out at my sister-in-law's new condo, and we ripped up all the carpet and we're getting ready to lay all this new flooring. And I grab a T-square and I go to the corner, and there's not a 90-degree corner in the entire building, right? Like this happens a lot in building. So then the question becomes, well, we want to lay the flooring straight. How do you lay flooring straight when there's not a straight wall? Right? That's the question. And it's a math problem, right? How do I find a straight line in a non-straight space? Now, if every wall, like the corner's a 90-degree wall and I could just run the first row down and I know that first row is straight, But what we found is even just the first row of lane was off by almost 5 inches from where we started to where it ended. And if we'd have just followed the wall, your flooring would have just kept looking like it was diving into the wall. And so it was really, because that was the problem. And a lot of people get stuck there, right? They're just like, well, I don't know how to find a straight line. Well, yeah, you do. It's like 5th grade math. We do it again in 7th grade math. Like there's a lot of ways to find a straight line if you have a corner. Yep. I used a 3, 4, 5 triangle, right? I measure out 3 feet. I measure out 4 feet. I know the hypotenuse is 5 feet. And where that hits, I can draw a straight line, and that became our line, right? And I'm just thinking, man, it wasn't about knowing that what a right triangle was and what the formula was back in the day, but man, does it matter now, right? How do you find a straight line? Use it all the time in building fences. Same thing. Like, how do you know that it's 90 degree in the corner when you go to like make your fence? It's a 3, 4, 5 triangle. Yeah, contractors use it all the time. And it's so cool because you walk around sounding really smart because, you can remember 4th grade math.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's great. But to that point, right? Like there's a problem. How do I solve it? And then what can I lean on from my math experience? And getting people, especially with math, I find, and maybe Trisha, it goes back to, we came from, we had a running joke in my math class of, is today the even numbers in the book or the odd numbers in the book? Like we would almost have like a side bet going on if we could actually exchange money and had money, right? But getting to a place where it's just this idea of getting curious. Can you get to a place where you're curious enough, you're willing to go find the answer? You're willing to go out and try to figure it out. And what can you lean on from your past to actually get over it? Because especially with math, so many people are just like, well, I don't know how to do it. I would like to create a budget, but I don't know how to set up an Excel spreadsheet. Well, you do. It's adding and subtracting and being able to, it's just, but you have to get to a point where it's this, I don't know. What is it? It's this problem solving mindset, right? And how do we engage in that math?
What I love, though, is that what we're also talking about is part of that mindset is a willingness to have conversations with others, right? Yeah. Not to like, if any member of my family is listening to this right now, like no shade towards you, but like sometimes we'll have that conversation about like, oh, there's this issue. Do we talk about it or not? And honestly, like, when we're talking about the power of conferences, we're talking about the power of a thought partner, of exchange of ideas, of talking through the issue, right? And I really think at a societal level, it's like that's been undervalued. But I think there is really great value in saying, I don't know the answer yet. Can you talk this through with me, right? So that I can almost like hear myself processing, have somebody else even ask me like, well, why did you make that assumption? Or, again, like you've got so many great sentence question starters in the book. There's huge value in that. However, I think if we don't grow up with that as an experience, it's really easy to think like, well, what's the point of talking about X, right? Yeah. And of course, there's a huge value in having that thought partner. So folks, again, the book is Conferring in the Math Classroom, a practical guidebook to using 5-minute conferences to grow confident mathematicians. And I feel like on this episode, we've talked about just like confident, caring individuals as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Picha, for coming on to share more about that book.
Thank you all for having me. This has been a great opportunity. I love any opportunity to talk about math ed and particularly talking with our kiddos.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Just a reminder, you can save $25 on any of our learning pathways at shiftingschools.com by using the code SSPOD25 at checkout. If you like today's show, or if you have something you'd like us to talk about, send us an email at info@shiftingschools.com. And of course, rates and reviews are always appreciated. Until next time, we'll see you on the network.